First of all, Brad, thank you for that song. Thanks to Buddy as well, and to Aiden Bubak. You guys, it's such a treat to have you join in with us this morning. And what a great song, Brad, to bring to where we are on Sunday, on Easter Sunday, right? A great day to be alive. And especially in the context of what I just said prior to you singing, was we're in this messiness still. It's still this time of change and challenge. It's a strange time to be in. And yet what better time to be thinking about what it means to be alive, right? And what better time than to think on Resurrection Sunday? So I want to assuage any of your anxieties or assumptions that you might have, because I'm going to talk about the resurrection story. We are a curious community. We are deeply skeptical at times. We are questioning. We're compassionate. We're open-minded. A friend of mine calls us the inclusive ears, because we are accepting of, we include everyone in this community, regardless of your sexual orientation, your financial orientation, your socioeconomic status, your religious orientation. This is a wide space for dialectical engagement, right? So we have that opening thing that we do with our service from Rumi, the poem, "Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. It doesn't matter, ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, even if you have broken your vows 1,000 times, come yet again." That's kind of the essence of who this community is. It made me think of this Hoja story. You remember Hoja, the wise fool in the Middle East, the 13th century, part of the Islamic Sufist tradition. So Hoja is making his way home. It's nighttime, it's dark. And he looks behind him and he sees some people following him. Well, he kind of panics. He starts ruminating. His mind starts imagining all sorts of dire possibilities, and he's wondering why they're chasing him now. So he needs to hide. So he quickly finds a graveyard, and he quickly goes into the graveyard, finds an empty grave spot, jumps into the hole and lays on his back, closes his eyes. A few minutes later, here comes this group of people who've been following him, and they look in the hole and they know him. They know him, it's Hoja. They look down and they say, "Hoja, why are you here?" And Hoja looks up and he smiles. He says, "I've been pondering that, and I've come to the conclusion that you are here because I'm here. So I must be here because you're here." That's really what this is about, this community. Hang on to that idea. We're here because we are all here. We're here for each other. The story that I want to share with you comes out of the Gospel of John, chapter 20, and I'm going to just paraphrase it quickly. It's different from the other stories. This resurrection story is very different from the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and for several reasons that I think are really important. I'll get to that in a minute, but here it is summarized. Basically, the story says, on the first day of the new week, Jesus has been crucified. He's been buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, the wealthy man who gave them this free tomb, beautiful garden, and this free tomb. And so Mary goes on the first day of the new week, Mary Magdalene. She's going to anoint his body with herbs and spices and oils. And it's basically Sunday on the first day of the new week. So she goes and finds the tomb empty. The stones rolled back. The tomb is empty. She doesn't see anything but the cloth. She begins to panic and weep. And then suddenly she runs back and tells the other disciples. Well, they come running and they see the empty tomb. They see that it's empty too, except for the cloths. They don't see anybody else there. And then they go home. Mary stays. She continues to weep when suddenly two people have appeared, two shapes, two human forms that are dressed like angels, I suppose, white arraignment. And once they're sitting at each end of this stone bed, and they look up, they say, "Why are you weeping?" She says, "Someone has taken my Lord." And then she hears a voice to her side, and she looks out and she sees someone there. Well, she doesn't recognize it as Jesus. It says she mistakes him for the gardener. And she says, "Sir, where have you taken my Lord? If you'll tell me where you've put him, I'll go and get him myself." And then she hears the man say, "Mary." She recognizes the voice as Jesus's. And then she says, "Rabboni," Lord, or my Savior, my teacher. She says she mistakes him. The text says she mistakes him as the gardener. That's important. A couple of quick observations and then some thoughts that came to me as I was looking at this. First of all, all the Gospels are the same. The women are the first ones to get to the tomb, either for anointing with oils. It was a traditional role for the women to play, but also some of these women were actually followers of Jesus. They were part of the disciples of Jesus. And the interesting thing is that they all go back to tell the disciples, and as the other stories say, the disciples come and they find the empty tomb and they go back home. John's Gospel is the only one that has Mary staying there. And then the other interesting thing is that John's Gospel is the only one that has Jesus there. And when Jesus is there, she doesn't see him, she sees the gardener. Why would she see him as the gardener? That's important to think about. So that's the one observation. The other observation is this idea that John's Gospel was written at a different time and for a different purpose. All these Gospels were written around 55 AD to 70 AD, so anywhere from 25 to 40, 50 years after Jesus' death. But the Gospel of John was written somewhere close to 70 to 80 years after Jesus' death, around 100, 110 AD. Now, the fall of the temple and fall of Jerusalem to the Roman Empire happened in 70 AD. And that's important because that means that most of the synoptic Gospels were written by that point or being written at that point, whereas John's Gospel was written 30 to 40 years even after that. So there's been a great diaspora, and they're all scattered. The Jewish community is scattered all about, and the Jewish followers of Jesus are scattered about as well. And perhaps what's even more important is this idea that if you think about it, 70 to 80 years have passed since Jesus' death. 70 to 80 years represents 3 generations at least of Christian or Jesus followers that have come and gone. The early idea that was in the Christian community or the following community that thought that Jesus would be returning imminently and take over and rule as the king, that didn't happen. So John's writing to this whole new understanding of who Jesus is. Again, important because it's a different way of seeing. It's a new lens. The old stories, the old understanding had to change. So there's a few things I would like to point out. The first thing is, where would a Jewish listener find another story about a garden? Where would a Jewish listener hearing this story from John's Gospel immediately think of a garden in the biblical tradition? Obviously, it's in Genesis. The first creation story, God creates life, creates this rich, abundant life, vegetation, this garden of life out of chaos. And God is seen in tradition as the gardener. This shouldn't surprise us then that John is also using this same idea of gardener, because John sees Jesus identified with the creative force of God, essentially. In John's Gospel, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, logos, Greek for word, means creative force, creativity. So in the beginning was this creativity. Well, now the gardener is standing outside, and Mary, who's looking for Jesus, sees the gardener. She mistakes him for a gardener. Come on. I mean, do you see the connection there? What is John saying about how we understand our relationship with this mystery? So, first thing that I want to get across to you then, the first idea, main idea. It's important to understand that the hearers of John's Gospel in his time 2,000 plus years ago didn't think about stories the same way that we, post-Enlightenment, post-modernist, literary people, the same way that we think about stories. They saw stories completely different. Oddly enough, when we hear a story, we're like the second grader in class who raises her hand and says, wait a minute, what color was Jesus' hair? Did he still have hair? Did he smell bad? They're looking for concrete details as if it was a historical event. Is it true? Did it really happen? Now, as adults, though, we've matured and we carry around all sorts of existential baggage and our fear of death and mortality, and we look for concrete answers to these problems, oftentimes turning to the Bible for concrete kinds of answers, looking for literal historical kinds of answers. Or if not, then we tend to view the whole thing as kind of useless fairy tales and magical thinking of a time long ago. But here's the truth that I want to suggest. Ancient hearers of story weren't listening for history or for concrete facts. They listened for a sacred mystery that broke through the cracks of their existence to bring about meaning, to bring about hope. The ancient hearers of stories weren't listening for history and concrete facts. They were listening for sacred mystery that would break through the cracks to bring hope. In other words, when we try to make story into history, it becomes static, it becomes objectified, and we turn it into either like a creed or empty ideas. And for many, it starts to lose its ability to speak a deeper meaning over time, a deeper truth. Second idea. The Old Testament story of the first creation has often been understood as an image for shalom. Throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Torah and the Old Testament, lambs will lie down with lions, swords will be beaten into plowshares. The original covenant between God and the Hebrew people was this idea of a place of equity, of a place of mutuality, a place of justice and humility. Basically, it was a place for God's rest and shalom. But get this, the actual story, the actual creation story in Genesis was written during a time of Babylonian captivity. The Hebrew people were in captivity to the Babylonian Empire. They were abused, they were treated cruelly, they were slaves. And during this harsh reality, during this time of terror and despair, out of that time came this story of hope. Came this gardener that created order, that created possibility out of despair. John, if you think about it, John's gospel is written in the same context, right? I mean, just 30 years earlier, the Johannine community had witnessed the fleeing of peasants, probably some of their own family members, Jewish peasants fleeing Jerusalem, fleeing Roman aggression and soldiers, and being trapped as they escaped the city and executed by way of crucifixion. Hundreds, Josephus, the historian, says hundreds, even thousands of Jewish peasants were crucified, and their bodies then were hung around the walls of the besieged city for all to see. I mean, this horrific reality still fresh in their minds as they lived in these secluded communities, scattered communities. And it's out of that reality that John writes his gospel. That John says, Mary looks into the emptiness, and beside her she sees a gardener. Do you see it? I mean, come on, you see the connection? What a beautiful image for such a time. This idea of resurrection is part of this creating out of the chaos. So here's the third idea then. Resurrection is not resuscitation, right? You probably know that. That's nothing new for you. Resurrection is not resuscitation, it's participation. Resurrection is participation. And this may be the most radical idea that I'm thinking, is that when we limit resurrection to resuscitation, the idea that we're going to bring something dead back to life, when we do that, we aren't creating anything new, right? We're just simply bringing back the same thing that it was before. This misses the point entirely, because resurrection is this new creation. The first day of the new week, something new is going to happen. Resurrection is the creation of something new out of this messiness, out of this chaos, the possibility, the logos, the ground of being that suggests we can participate in this. It's not bringing something dead to life. It's bringing life to life. It's about seeing the world with more possibility. It's a new way of seeing the world. It's a way of seeing the world as creative, as redemptive. Our mortal experiences of chaos, our fears and losses, oppression and abuses, instead of holding us captive, that very chaos says, create something new. This messy garden, this detritus, this chaos, What is inviting to be created in the midst of all of that? Resurrection sees it differently. How are we to participate in bringing life to life? And we see this because it's been in Jesus' words all along. It was in his teachings, right? We find Jesus, we find the Christ, we find the resurrected Christ in the faces of the enemy, in feeding the hungry, in empowering the marginalized, in righting injustice. Resurrection is how we bring life to life. It's about what we do in life and not what happens after life. So Emily Levine was a philosopher and a comedian. What a great combination. She was a scientist and a philosopher, a Jewish comedian. She was one of the writers, the directors of Designing Women, a number of different sort of comedy shows that she participated in. She wrote her own show, a film that was called Emily on the Edge of Chaos, and it starred all sorts of great actors and actresses and even scientists. I mean, so many people really participated in this woman's life, really joined with her and connected with her. But in 2018, she developed a fourth stage cancer with a brain tumor, and she gave a TED Talk in 2019, not too long before she died. So it's worth checking it out. If you want to, she'll just bring a smile to your face in listening to her. But she says a couple of things right off the bat when she speaks. She says, the first thing is to tell you, I'm going to die. I have stage 4 cancer. I'm going to die soon. And I'm great. She said, I'm great. It's great to be alive. And I've started to see everything from the perspective of physics. When I listened to her, I thought to myself, she's really seeing everything spiritually too. She says, there's wave-particle duality, and I don't understand it all completely, but we know somehow there's that one thing can manifest itself as two things. She said, that idea gave me hope, because I began to realize that people are like that. They can be two things at the same time. People are not one way or the other. People can be both good and bad. We can be both right and wrong. And then there's this whole slight variation on that, she says, which is while reality looks like two things simultaneously, it turns out that it's all about interaction, interdependency of all those things. Like space and time are really the same thing. Like mass and energy are really coexistent, and life and death, it's really the same thing. She said, you have to understand that we don't live in a Newtonian clockwork universe anymore. We live in an onion peel universe, layers upon layers unwrapping, and somehow it's all still interconnected, and we won't ever be able to know everything or control everything or predict everything, except to know that sometimes it can make you cry. And it can taste really great. This garden we are in, it's kind of like we're in this self-driving car. It reminds me of the old joke of the daughter who's riding with her older mother, middle-aged daughter's riding with her mother, and her mother's driving, and they pass through a red light. She doesn't want to say anything to her mother because she knows how her mother's going to get so upset, and so she just holds her tongue. But then they pass through a second red light, and finally the daughter says, Mom, I've got to say something. You've passed through 2 red lights. And the mother looks over at her and says, oh, I'm driving? It feels like that at times, right? We have to pay attention to participate. Sometimes it's overwhelming. Sometimes we don't realize where we are. But we are here because we are all here. I'm here for you because you're here. You're here because I'm here. We pay attention. We try to be present to where we are, to who we are with, and what we bring to the moment, or maybe even what we can make in the moment to bring more interest to life, to make it more helpful, even more delightful. I did have the chance to witness a lot of stories during this time that I was in renewal leave. I participated in different online groups all over the country, Story Center out of San Francisco, a rabbinical group that was out of New York, and other groups that were from all over the country. All of these involved people from around the world. It was fascinating. And it was all about stories arising out of where we are right now. With COVID, with our countries, with the crises in our communities. So in South Africa, in Colombia, in New Zealand, all of these stories. And somehow there was a resonant thread. The more intentionally we listened, the more we began to realize we weren't alone. We all shared in these stories. And something about the witnessing of story empowered the one telling this story. Time and time again, in the crafting difficult conversations, we hear from others, we hear from one another, how just that power of listening to us as we try to articulate what it is we feel or what it is we think, how that empowers us to find a better path toward communication, toward not necessarily agreement even, but toward a way of honoring one another. We can bring life to life. That's really what resurrection is. It's not denying the pain, but it's realizing that there's a path to redeeming loss, a path to recreating delight in our most difficult moments. Mortality and life are no longer enemies, dualities. They're of either or, but they are one and the same, in the very same way that a garden is a place filled with life and death, simultaneously, always giving way to one another. The tomb in a garden is empty, but it's not lifeless. It's full of possibilities. Something new is happening, and Mary looks over and thinks she sees the gardener. What if resurrection is about the generativity that's in life? It's not about making sure I don't have to be afraid of death because I'm going to come back to life, but instead it has more to do with making sure I enter life now creatively, courageously, compassionately, here and now, raging against the machine. It starts somewhere. It has to start sometime. What better place than now? What better place than here? What better time than now? It's counterintuitive to our neurology and our tendency to be afraid or uncomfortable, and to our popular cultural myth of the importance of acquisition and power and control. It says, what kind of world are you co-creating in all the mess? This is what the story is about. When Emily ends her talk, she quotes Carlo Rovelli, the physicist, and she says, "We've come to realize that we don't always know why these different parts of quantum physics work the way they do. But what we do know," he says, "all reality is interaction." And then she tears up a little bit as she points to the audience. And then back to herself. And she says, it's like how you being here brings life to me. And maybe my being here has brought some life to you. And then she said, you and I, we make each other real. Isn't that resurrection? Mary looks aside the empty tomb and she thinks she sees a gardener.